Hello, and thank you for joining us. We are going to wait another minute for other attendees to log in. While we wait, we are going to play our Wellbeing Together film.
Interested in your organization's well-being, but not sure where to start or how your existing well-being offering is working? British Safety Council has worked with experts to create well-being solutions suitable for organizations at any stage, including our unique Being Well Together program, the integrated solution for your health, safety, and well-being needs. Our research indicates that only 49% of companies have a written well-being strategy, and of those, most don't measure effectiveness. Our solutions help you identify gaps in well-being provision, providing clear guidance on how to address them. Becoming a supporter of the Being Well Together program means access to tools and resources, allowing you to effectively develop and implement a health, safety, and well-being strategy in a joined-up, holistic way. See the health and well-being of your workforce improve and make the most of your investments. Find out more at beingwelltogether.org.
Hello, and welcome to our webinar entitled Work-Related Stress, Risk Assessment, the Why, the What, the How. Research showed that integrating health and safety and well-being together into strategy make both financial and business sense. At British Safety Council, we are passionate about helping organizations like yours to do that. We want to help you put well-being at the heart of your organization. So in today's webinar, you will hear from our guest speaker, Dr. Carolyn Yeoman, Organisational Psychologist, Managing Director, Highley Yeoman, who will explore the work-related stress risk assessment. There will be also the opportunity for questions at the end of the session with Dr. Carolyn and British Safety Council Head of Wellbeing, Marcus Herbert. Before we begin, I want to let you know that due to the number of attendees for our webinar, everyone except the speakers will be on mute during the event. However, the speaker will welcome your question. And so if you have any queries or comments as we go along, please do note them in the Q&A box on your panel, and they will be answered during our Q&A session at the end. If you wish to tweet or post about this event, please do use the hashtag #BeingWellTogether. Should you need to leave the event at any point, please do not worry, as we will be sending out the recording of the whole webinar in due course. I would like to take the opportunity now to introduce our speakers. We are delighted to welcome Dr. Carolyn Yeoman as our speaker today. Dr. Carolyn is an organizational psychologist with significant experience in health, safety, and well-being culture change. She is passionate and results-oriented, with proven track record of driving health, safety, and well-being behavioral and cultural change within a diverse range of national and international business. She is skilled at guiding organizations by engaging with both senior leadership team and frontline staff. Her aim is always to help to create a sustainable change within the organization, thereby enabling them not only to maintain but continuously improve their health, safety, and well-being culture. Carolyn is comfortable challenging what she sees when required, and she has developed the ability to work and communicate to all organizational levels. from demonstrating a practical hands-on approach through an empowering enablers to achieve result by coaching and influencing. She is an enthusiastic and motivational consultant, trainer and facilitator, and is a tenacious and self-motivated. She is considered an expert in her field, and she's a regular conference speaker. She has published many papers and academic journals, articles, and has co-authored a book with Professor Sir Cary Cooper. Carolyn has successfully run her own business for nearly 30 years and has also worked at a HSC as a principal psychologist. Her consultancy experience spanned numerous industry sectors, including construction, oil and gas, food, utilities, packing, and retail. Marcus Herbert is head of wellbeing at the British Safety Council. With over 15 years experience and 2 degrees in the wellbeing industry, Marcus has worked with individuals, elite athletes, and executives on enhancing their own personal well-being and reducing their risk of lifestyle disease through effective behavior change strategies. Transferring this experience into a corporate setting, Marcus has worked with organizations from micro to global on their approach to organizational well-being and how to develop an effective and meaningful well-being strategy. More recently, Marcus has developed training courses to support directors, line managers, and employees on the most effective way to embrace health and well-being at work. So without further ado, let me pass you over to Marcus to formally introduce the event.
Great, thank you so much, Susanna, for the lengthy intro. Appreciate the time you've put into all of that information being pulled together. And listen, everybody, welcome. Thank you for joining us for our first wellbeing webinar of 2024. If you were with us for our webinar series in 2023 and you've come back, then welcome. And if this is a new webinar for you joining us, then also welcome to you. So we've decided to change things up with our webinar series of 2024. We've actually decided to now make them a quarterly event towards the end of the quarter and to have targeted messaging leading up to the kind of main event. And if you've been subscribed to the newsletters or you've been paying attention to our social media, you'll see that we've been putting out messaging around the importance of taking a strategic approach to well-being. And of course, when you're taking a strategic approach to well-being, you may well identify that mental health or stress is an area of focus for you. We've also put out some messaging this quarter around the value and the impact that line managers can have on stress and mental health within the workplace. We'll delve into a little bit more detail actually into that within Karen's presentation. And then the third part of the messaging has actually been, well, how do you take the concept of stress within the workplace and apply a level of risk assessment to it so you can understand what are the causes and what can you do to mitigate those causes for the future. And all of that messaging has led towards us, it's almost the premiere of all of the important information being brought together in one place, being delivered by somebody that, well, we couldn't think of anybody better to come and deliver some messaging around this topic. And of course, we're leading into Stress Awareness Month next month. So we felt this would be the perfect time to actually bring all of that information together. So during the actual presentation itself, I will, as many of you might be pleased to hear, go on mute and turn my camera off. I'll hand over to our guest speaker, Carolyn, and then I'll come back towards the end to support with the Q&A. So Karen, thank you very much. Over to you.
Thank you, Marcus. I'm delighted to be here today talking about work-related stress risk assessment on behalf of British Safety Council and Being Well Together. We've got quite a lot potentially to get through, so I'm going to try and be as sort of as succinct as I can, but there's an outline of what I'd like to try and get through during this session. So just starting off with sort of setting the scene in terms of work-related stress risk assessment within the wider wellbeing space, as Marcus has just said, briefly talking about the strategy and the important role of leadership, again, as Marcus has just talked about, and then to spend a little bit more time thinking about, well, work-related stress risk assessment, why do we want to do it? What is it? How do we do it? And more importantly, how do we use that to then put in place focused interventions that we are able to measure and evaluate, because this is one of the really big areas that most organisations fail to do, is evaluate whether what they're doing is actually having any impact or not. So just to start us thinking about this area, the HSE stats, the latest ones, you'll probably all have seen. So those figures are still really poor. Obviously, we've got a big issue within the UK still regarding work-related stress, depression and anxiety. I think for me, one of the most important sort of bullet points there is the fourth one. So if we accept that in general, 90% of employees don't cite work-related stress, depression or anxiety as their reason for absence from work, then obviously those figures are a gross underestimate of the actual scale of the problem. And HSE does acknowledge that. So we know that the problem is actually much worse than those stats would initially suggest. And we also know that workplace pressure combined with lack of managerial support or poor leadership behaviours are the two key stressors that are cited by individuals who are suffering with work-related stress, depression or anxiety. So this really is a problem that isn't going away, and obviously we need to continue to look at ways in which we can move our organisations forward. So as Marcus said, for the first quarter, Being Well Together has been focusing very much on wellbeing, and started earlier on in the year with helping you to think about what is a strategic approach to workplace wellbeing. And I think it's really important just to reiterate this a little bit here. So I think the video said 49% of organisations don't have a wellbeing strategy, but certainly CIPD say that 37% of SMEs don't have a wellbeing strategy. So larger organisations are more likely to. In my experience, most of those wellbeing strategies are very much focused on interventions designed to help the individual. So very much what I would call a bikes and bananas type approach. And there's nothing wrong with that at all. So I don't want to give the impression that I'm not a fan of those things, because certainly I am. And we need to do everything we can to support our individuals within workplaces. So things like employee assistance programs, mental health first aiders, resilience building programs, cycle to work schemes, fruit bowls, all of those things that we do to help and support our individuals, they are really, really important. But so too are the other two elements which we need when we're looking at a wellbeing strategy. So for me, a wellbeing strategy has three key elements or three key areas of focus. That's around the organisation and the leadership, as well as the people. And as I said, we're doing the people bit really well, I think, generally. But what we need to start to do is look at our leaders and equipping them in terms of having conversations and in terms of helping them understand their own leadership behaviour. And we also need to start with that proactive risk management approach, where we look at our organisation and ask the question, what are we doing to our people, and what can we do to change things or make them better? So that's a sort of quick summary of the strategy that we really would like to see around workplace wellbeing. And then, as Marcus said, the second area that Being Well Together has focused on so far has been around this critical role of leaders. And this really does need to be part of our strategic approach, particularly given that leadership behaviour is the second most common cause of work-related stress. So it's really, really important that we start to think about our leaders. And our leaders, they're in a difficult position often themselves. So many people, particularly in line management positions, are the ones who are suffering the most from stress within our organisations because of that squeeze from the top and the bottom. So we know it's not an easy role to be in at the moment anyway. And added to that, we know that our leaders actually can be stress inducers or stress buffers. So they can actually be the causes of stress, or a lot of causes of stress within a team, but equally, they can actually be really, really good at helping to mitigate and reduce stress within the team. And I think an important thing to consider here is we're doing lots and lots of really, really good work around upskilling our leaders in terms of having conversations with individuals or teams about mental health or work-related stress, etc. So having those conversations. The bit that I think we're still missing is this sort of insight. So helping our leaders to think about their own leadership behaviours and what impact that may or may not be having upon their team. And I think that's an area that we need to expand going forward, because what we actually know when we're talking about work-related stress and general sort of team engagement is it's not about leadership style, it's about leadership behaviours, and they're very different. So the leadership behaviours are those behaviours we actually enact when we're with our teams, and we can develop and change those leadership behaviours irrespective of what our leadership style is. So we've got quite a lot of work to do still with our leaders, but we've certainly made a really, really good start in terms of trying to sort of reduce the stigma around mental health and work-related stress. So if we move on to the third area, again, as Marcus just suggested, which is around, well, what can we do in terms of work-related stress risk assessment? How can we actually start to understand what's happening within our businesses? As I say, really, this should be the first bit of the strategy. So before we do anything else, before we do any of the people stuff or the leadership stuff, really, we should be starting with some sort of assessment of where are we, so that we can understand, you know, if we don't know where we are, it's quite difficult to know where you want to be and how to get there. So we need this proactive, risk-based assessment of where we are. And we can collect that data from lots and lots of different sources. And I'm going to talk a little bit later when I talk about how we might do it. I'm going to talk quite a bit about sort of HSE's recommendations, how they approach it in terms of the management standards. But we can also collect lots and lots of data from other sources. So, you know, things like absence data, return to work interviews, exit interviews, information coming in from employee assistance programs, from our mental health first aiders, just from conversations generally that are happening within our business, or from employee engagement surveys. So we can collect initially, before we even start doing an actual risk assessment, we can start to collect lots and lots of data. And I would encourage you to do that, because the more we can draw together those different sources of data, the more likely we are to be able to demonstrate the impact of what we've done in a lot of different areas. So I would encourage you to try and draw together what data you do have. And I appreciate not all organisations have lots of data, but that you do, just pull it together so that you can start to look at that in the future and see what impact doing your work-related stress risk assessment or wellbeing interventions, what impact that's actually had. So why should we be conducting it? Well, obviously, most of what I've talked about so far really has been the sort of moral case that we shouldn't have people being made ill by their work, whether that's physically or mentally ill. And I don't think anybody would argue with that. You know, we do have a moral case as organisations to look after our people. I think the financial and business case is also quite well understood now. You know, it makes sense. Happy, healthy workers are good for business. So they are more productive. They take less time at work. They have less presenteeism, so they're more in the moment at work. They show more discretionary effort. They're less likely to leave, so we're more likely to retain the talented people that we do have. They have better relationships at work. And the list is endless. And there's lots and lots of research out there where you can, you know, if you need to use that to persuade people higher up within the organisation, to persuade the board or senior leadership teams of why it's important to do this, there's lots and lots of data out there that talks about what the financial benefits are. And one particularly good report is one that was done by Deloitte. So I would encourage you to look that up if you need some real figures to take to the board. But we also shouldn't forget the legal case. And, you know, we're talking about being well together is about bringing, you know, health, safety and well-being into the same space. And I think that's key here, because often we forget when we start to talk about well-being, and often we talk about the more sort of intangible, sort of soft and fluffy side of well-being. What we forget is that actually it is a tangible part of health, safety and well-being. And we do have a legal duty under the Health and Safety at Work Act and the Management of Health and Safety at Work regs to protect the mental and physical health of our people. So that has always been there since 1974. As organisations, we are supposed to have been treating health in the same way as we treat safety. And I know traditionally that hasn't happened. You know, as Susanna said, I've been working in the health, safety and wellbeing field for 30 years. And you know, I know as well as you do that in general it's safety that's taken the prime position, and that's where we've put our focus, and potentially quite rightly in the past. But if we take the lessons we've learned from how we manage safety and apply those to health and well-being, it actually makes the process much more tangible, because we know what to do with safety. We know that with safety, you know, we go out, we look for hazards, we identify the risk, and we look for ways to reduce or mitigate that risk. And that's exactly the same approach that we need to be taking when we're looking at the health of our workforce. And I think we're starting to do that much more in terms of physical health. So, you know, most organisations will be looking at things like noise and dust and all of those health hazards that are in our environment. But the mental health stuff is still a difficult area, I think, for a lot of organisations to get to grips with. And so that's why the focus very much from HSE at the moment is on mental health and on work-related stress, because it's causing such a big issue in terms of absenteeism and presenteeism and increased accidents. So if people aren't mentally and physically healthy, they are much more at risk of having an accident and much more at risk of making errors within the workplace. So this is really an area that HSE is starting to focus on, that they've now trained inspectors on, and it's an area that we will start to see questions being asked when you get your inspections around, well, what are you doing in terms of mental health and wellbeing and work-related stress risk assessment? And I think, in all honesty, as long as you can show that you've started, that's going to be okay for now. I think it's if we're unable to say what we're doing, or if all we're able to say is, well, we've trained our managers and we've got an EAP and some mental health first aiders, because HSE have made it very clear that that isn't proactive and it's not risk management. So we need to get back to the basics of what we do for safety, for health and wellbeing, and start to look at the risk that exists within our work environment. And I think an important point here to be sort of clear about is what HSE would define as work-related stress. And so it's that adverse reaction that we have when we've got excessive pressure or demands placed upon us. And the important point here is this difference between pressure and stress. So stress is bad, in simple terms. Stress is bad. We can't have positive stress. We can't have, you know, some stress is good for you. Stress is a physiological response where our body is saying, help, this is too much. So stress is bad. Pressure, on the other hand, is good. So we need pressure to get out of bed in the morning. Some of us need more pressure than others. But once that pressure becomes excessive and it becomes to the point where we tip into stress and the stress response, that's bad. So we need to be really clear within our organisations when we're looking at stress risk assessment that we're talking about too much pressure and that stress response. And so I would encourage you to have some sort of definition that people can work with and understand what's too much and what's not. And I think the reason why it's been quite difficult for organisations to start to do the work-related stress risk assessments is because our response to pressure, when pressure becomes too much, is different for every one of us. So we can't, whereas with safety, we can often say that's unsafe and that puts people at risk and here's what we're going to do about it. In this instance, it's, you know, workload, for example. What is too high workload for one person won't be for another. So it's very, very difficult to start to assess, well, exactly what are we looking at here? But the management standards approach that HSE defines actually does help us to get a real handle on that and to understand what we need to do certainly from a legal perspective in terms of addressing work-related stress. And what HSE did, and it's about 30 years ago now, when they started to look at work-related stress and what organisations needed to do to better manage it and to understand it. They did a lot of research which identified basically 6 key areas that are likely to lead to work-related stress within an organisation. So in a sense, these are stressors, 6 key stressors that we know exist within organisations potentially. And what they've always suggested is that if we look at these 6 areas, then we're likely to be able to understand where stress risk lies within our businesses. And I'm going to talk a little bit more shortly about how they suggest that you do that. But essentially, you can use this within any other survey you might already have. So you might have a wellbeing survey, and you can sort of slot these areas within that. You might have, be having conversations with groups of people through focus groups or engagement groups, and you might want to use these 6 within that. So it's not too prescriptive, but it's the 6 key areas that we know are most likely to lead to stress within an organisation. And as I said earlier, demands or workload particularly is number 1, along with leadership. And leadership can span a number of these, but often it will fall within support, relationships, but sometimes within demands and control. So I think there's a general understanding now that we would ask questions around leadership as well, or management, in addition to these 6. But they're the 6 key areas that we need to be looking at. And with change, just to say that with change, obviously change is constant, but it's about really communication about change. So how do we communicate, consult, engage with people around change? Because what we know is the more that people understand what's happening, the less stressful that is for them. So often what we do within organisations is we think we protect people by saying, well, there's going to be a change, but we're not quite sure what, so we won't say anything yet. And then the Chinese whispers start, and people start having conversations, and suddenly it's escalated into some huge change that's about to happen. So the more we can just give that narrative as we go along that says, yes, something's coming, we're not sure what yet, as soon as we know what it is, we'll let you know. The more we can do that, the more we know that reduces stress levels within our teams. So those are called the management standards. Those 6 are what HSE refer to as the management standards. And then in terms of how to conduct a work-related stress risk assessment, HSE very much talk about what they would call the management standards approach. And that's actually the little diagram that you can see on the right of the screen. And I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about that because there's tons of information about it on the HSE website. So if you go onto HSE and look under work-related stress, there's a lot more detail and guidance about this. But essentially what it's saying is you need to set up an actual process or procedure that allows you to identify which of those 6 areas are likely to be causing stress within your teams. So that once you've identified which areas, so where the risk lies, then you can start to identify, well, what could we potentially do about it? And I've already said that, you can use existing data. So HSE basically says you need to do an organisational level stress risk assessment, so not an individual one. So that's the first thing. You're not expected to assess every single individual within your organisation as an individual and understand what their stress levels are and where the sources of stress are. If somebody actually comes to you and says that they're suffering from work-related stress or they've been off work with work-related stress, then obviously, yes, you need to do an individual stress risk assessment. And that's different, but you can still use those same 6 stressors to do that. But what HSE says is you need to look at an organisation as a whole and identify where the hotspots are, where the at-risk groups are, and then work with those groups initially. So that's what HSE would expect to see. If they came in and inspected you and said, what are you doing? They'd expect you to be able to explain that you've got some sort of handle on whether there are departments, levels within the organisation that you feel are more at risk, and the data to support that. And where is that data? Where does it come from? What you can then do is use this management standards approach to actually help you to have the conversations and understand in more detail what it is exactly that's causing those groups to suffer with work-related stress or potentially suffer with work-related stress, and what interventions, therefore, we need to implement to reduce those levels of stress. As I said before, you can do that in a number of different ways. So you can incorporate questions within existing wellbeing surveys. You might, as I say, choose to be running engagement groups, focus groups, and to address it that way. But there's also a tool called the Stress Indicator Tool, which is available from HSE, which is a survey that you can actually put out across the whole of your organisation. And it's free for smaller organisations. I think it's still, organisations of less than 60 is free to use. For organisations more than that, there is a licence fee. But the Stress Indicator Tool is there, set up, ready for you on a platform. You can't alter the actual question set, because obviously that's set by HSE in terms of understanding those 6 areas of stress. But what you can do is add other open questions at the end, or you can add demographics. So basically you could send the survey out to your whole organisation and then sort of slice and dice it however you like to try and understand where your at-risk groups are, where your hotspots are, where you really need to do a deeper dive and try and understand what's happening. I mean, potentially what you may find is that there are certain groups who are actually low risk, and that's fine, you record that. You know, these areas aren't from the Stress Indicator Tool aren't indicated as being an at-risk group. Therefore, we're going to focus on these areas which do appear to be more at risk. So that's a tool you can use. Again, you can go and have a read about it on the HSE website, but you can also, as I say, incorporate questions within your own surveys that you may have within your organisation. So the important thing, once we've got a handle on what our work-related stress sources of stress might be, is to think, well, okay, then, if those are where the problems are, then how do we put in place a solution? And this is where we've sort of gone slightly awry initially, in the sense that we've put in place lots of interventions in the past without any indication of whether they will actually solve a problem. Is the problem there in the first place? Does the problem exist? And so, although we know that things like EAPs, for example, mental health first aiders, although we know that obviously those are really important for the individuals who use them, and therefore I'm not suggesting we shouldn't have them. So they're of real benefit to the individuals that use them, because the percentage of people who actually use them is so small, then actually you don't see an impact at an organisational level. So when you try and evaluate the impact on an organisation of having an EAP or having mental health first aiders, you're not going to be able to show an impact, although, you know, inherently we know it's having an impact on those people who use it. At an organisational level, it's not mitigating the risk of work-related stress at all. So that's why it's so important. We talked about strategy at the beginning, but it's the plan that sits behind that strategy that is really important. And that plan can only be pulled together once we understand exactly where all our problems are and where they are, and we start to identify what the interventions are that we need to put in place. And those need to be tangible interventions. They might be, you know, the low-hanging fruit interventions, so the really quick and easy stuff to do that we can, you know, sit down with the team, have a chat, understand what the data is telling us, and we can put in place some stuff as a team really, really quickly. But some of them, and a lot of them at the moment, are bigger cultural issues. So they go right back up through the organisation, often to the top. And so they're very much about the need for some sort of culture change. And again, that's what happens with safety, and that's where we end up with safety culture change programmes. And that's really where our well-being should be, where our health and well-being should be, is looking at, well, okay, how do we put together a well-being culture change programme that not only addresses the low-hanging fruit that individual teams are able to address, but that also looks at the higher level and says, right, well, okay, what do we need to do strategically as an organisation? So it's really important that we start to not only have a strategy, but have a plan that sits behind it. And that plan needs to be a risk-based plan, so that we're able to say, this was the problem, this was the intervention, and this was the impact it had. And then we can start to say, yes, our wellbeing initiatives, our wellbeing interventions are actually doing what we need them to do. And that's where we will start to see a reduction in work-related stress within our businesses. And it's where we'll start to see all those positive impacts that will have. So, you know, increased productivity, retaining our talent, recruiting new talent, innovation. We know that's a big one. When people are stressed, you know, they tend not to be particularly creative or innovate very well. And you know, if we need anything more than that at the moment within the UK, we need our creativity, our innovation. We need to be able to drive our businesses and the country forward. So yeah, doing the work-related stress risk assessment is essential, but actually the real value is in those focused interventions. And I know that, you know, Being Well Together and the British Safety Council have a number of interventions that they're able to help support, including a lot of good work around leadership training and encouraging managers to have conversations. So, and that's as good a place as any to start, because we already know that, you know, poor leadership behaviour is the second most, well, it's likely to be the second most cause of stress within your own businesses. So I'm going to answer some questions hopefully shortly, but in the meantime, I'm just going to hand back to Marcus so that he can just take you through what British Safety Council and Being Well Together are able to offer you in this area. Marcus.
Karen, thank you so much for bringing some of those core topics to life, and crucially actually giving some real guidance to the attendees on how they can take some of this information away with them today and start to introduce that into some of their plans or complement some of the plans they're already working on. So thank you so much for bringing that to life. And as Carolyn said, before we actually go through some of the Q&A, I also selfishly have a couple of questions I've made a note of throughout, Karen. So we'll start with my questions, if that's okay.
Okay.
Well, what I wanted to just share with you is that if you are in a position where this might have whet the appetite, you might have been able to get information that you need from this session, and you can be on your merry way, then we're pleased for that, because part of these, the intention of these webinars is to share best practice, share learnings from experts, so that, you know, we can achieve our social change objectives as a charity. But if this hasn't quite hit the mark and you're looking for further support, then as Carolyn said, British Safety Council via Being Well Together can offer different support in the format of either online courses or classroom courses, which can be delivered either actually in person, in company offices, or virtually as well. We, of course, provide consultancy on stress risk management, and we also have audits in place. If you're already a follower of British Safety Council, you're more than likely be already familiar with our audit offering, but it also includes ISO 45001 and 45003. And simply, some of the training that you can see on screen, some of the titles of Start the Conversation, to actually start having a conversation about mental health in the workplace, Managing the Conversation, targeted more at those that might be supporting people within the organisation, Managing Stress within teams, actually undertaking the stress risk assessments for managers, and then also wider reach topics such as workplace health and wellbeing, training specifically written for those that are line managers. If you are interested or looking for more information, we do have our website on screen. You can take a note of that and have a look. We also have our email address, again, the bottom right. You can reach out to us via that email address. And as a result of attending the webinar today, you'll be eligible to have a 30-minute consultation with one of our team. So just reach out to us via that email address, and then we can book in that conversation. Now, we're going to go into the Q&A. So, Karen, if we just finish up on the final slide, and if you don't mind, Karen, I'm just going to ask my questions first, and then we'll have a look with the events team what questions have been submitted throughout.
Yeah.
So towards the beginning of your presentation, you shared the kind of important thought leadership statistics around reasons for absence within the workplace. And I think you made a really good point that actually, although we have stats on the amount of stress that is the reason for absence from the workplace, you made a point that actually maybe that isn't quite the full picture. Maybe some people actually have almost a barrier to report that stress is the reason why they're taking absence from work.
Mm-hmm.
Would you say, in your kind of experience, expanding way beyond my own, would you say that introducing a process of stress risk assessments in itself might actually help to shift the culture to be more open about the real reasons for absence from the workplace?
Yeah, absolutely. It can do if they're implemented in the correct way. And so when I showed that little circle from HSE about the management standards approach, that's very much encouraging the work-related stress risk assessment to be sort of sat within a wider conversation about mental health and well-being and reducing that stigma. Because again, at the end of the day, with the best will in the world, if you're asking people questions about how they're feeling in terms of their work, they are still potentially going to be reluctant to be honest. And the stress indicator tool from HSE is completely anonymous. I mean, I use it. I use others, but I use it with a number of organisations that I work with. And even though I know it's anonymous and there's no way of identifying individuals, I still get asked that question constantly. Like, I'm the only woman over 40 in that department, so you'll know it's me. And I've tried to explain over and over again that even though we may ask those questions within the demographics, we're not able to sort of join up all the dots and pinpoint individuals. So it doesn't put together groups of more than 10, of less than 10. So so things like that, it's really important to prepare the organisation almost and its people in advance to really make it clear before you start that this isn't, with the best will in the world, this isn't about individuals. So we don't want to highlight individuals. What we want to do is understand our business, our people, our culture, and what impact that is having on mental health. And that can take quite a while, that preparation stage. And it's getting the board, on board with that as well. So I don't think you can underestimate the importance of that preparation stage and trying to get all of that right to give yourself the best chance of actually really getting to what's happening within your business.
Yeah, that's I think as well, part of what you're talking about there almost partially answers a bit of the question that I was going to ask next, but I'll still ask the question because I can kind of frame it in a slightly different way. You've made the point that leadership style is at the moment reported as the second most common cause for stress within the workplace, behind workload.
Yeah.
And I think it's fair to say the vast majority, maybe not all, but the vast majority of leaders are not starting their day thinking, right, I'm going to cause some stress for my team today, because it's not good for business, and I know that's not the humane approach to take. But there is a risk that when we start to do stress risk assessments, if we identify that leadership style is within our organization the top or one of the top causes of stress within the workplace, it puts the leaders in a bit of a difficult spot. So you kind of touched on taking a planning approach to stress risk assessments. It's not just about doing stress risk assessments, but is there anything more that organizations could actually do to make sure that they've got support in place for the leaders before they might find out that the leaders are the cause of stress within their organization?
I think that's where quite a lot of the current sort of leadership training, and some of it was on your slide just before, is important, because that, even though it's not necessarily as I say, going as far as I would like in terms of leaders starting to understand themselves better, what it does do is start to open up that conversation about the fact that, yes, there's a lot of people within our organisation struggling at the moment. These are some of the sources of stress at work. Inadvertently, you might be one of those. So let's think about that. Let's understand that. And I think one of the really important things to realise within our businesses is that often we have these, technically brilliant people who we promote into leadership roles. We make them managers. And that's our standard sort of career progression, really, as it is within the UK, isn't it? It's our standard career progression is if you're good at a job, you get promoted into a management role. And most of the research shows that very few people actually get training prior to going into that role. So we basically chuck them in at the deep end and say, there you go, you've got a team, go and manage. They don't know really what to do, so that's stressful for them. And one of the things that we know happens when we're suffering from stress ourselves or poor mental health ourselves is that we sort of don't have time for the niceties. So inadvertently, we throw somebody into a leadership role. We don't give them the support and training they need. They therefore aren't working at their best, and they end up resorting to the old sort of almost command and control leadership style because they've not got the headspace to think, how should I word that? How could I say that differently? Oh, that might be offensive. So they just don't have the headspace to do it because they're trying desperately to perform in a role where they're getting squeezed from the top, pushed up from the bottom, and almost holding their heads. So I think we have to understand that being in those roles is a really difficult position to be in, and it's really easy, I think, sometimes when you do a strategy that says we need to address our leaders, it's almost blaming them. This is our problem with our leaders, and it's not. It's a cultural problem that starts higher up within our businesses. So I think the more we can do to educate our leaders almost before we do this stress risk assessment, I think the better, the more chance we stand of again trying to actually get to the root causes of what's happening and giving them the support that they need.
So the old adage of prevention is better than cure, I guess, that's more true than ever.
Yeah. And then helping them to develop as leaders, obviously helping them to develop those soft skills that most of them know they haven't got, but they would quite like to develop them.
Absolutely. So I'm going to restrain my selfishness with just one final question, and then we'll open it to taking a few questions from the audience. And it's a short question. Is one stress risk assessment enough?
You mean in terms of at one point in time?
So as in, if people were to leave today's session and they introduced a stress risk assessment process, and it was delivered once and repeated never again, would that suffice? No. So it's just as with safety, you have to keep your risk assessment sort of up to date. It's exactly the same, and that's how HSE looks at it. Some organisations hold their work-related stress risk assessments with their other risk assessments, and it's part of that, the management information system that says we update it every however. But I'd also say you would want to repeat it in order to evaluate the impact of what you're doing. Yeah. As I said, if you don't know where you're starting from, you don't know where you're going to, how are you getting there? The data is really important, just to be able to understand, have things shifted a little bit? You probably need to wait a couple of years, I would say. If you're going to do your stress risk assessment, take it seriously and actually put together a plan of targeted interventions. You need to allow some time for those to embed and for the culture to start to shift a bit. But 2 years is quite a good time frame to have an initial look at what impact you've had. Great, Carolyn. Well, I guess we can invite Susanna back into the webinar to take us through any kind of Q&A.
Yes, we received a few questions, but I think one is connected to yours, Marcus. So I'm gonna ask this. Is it a good template that they can utilize for these areas? Is there any advice or like a good template to use?
Doing stress risk assessments?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, so obviously within the UK, we have the HSE. Carolyn's already gone through those management standards, the 6 areas that if you've explored those 6 areas, then you're more than likely going to find the causes of stress within the organisation. We within British Safety Council have put together templates, for other organisations. As far as I'm aware, I mean, HSE obviously will be a good point of reference to see if there's templates specifically available from them. But what I would say is that although you could start with a template, ideally it needs to be adapted to suit the nature of the organisation. If we were to take, for example, the one element of the management standards, which is control, which of course has an impact on somebody's perception of stress within the workplace. Let's say that the vast majority of the workforce were actually in a manufacturing environment where they had to follow a very specific set of instructions within the role in order to deliver on their job. You may have less kind of control over what your job design looks like versus somebody that might be in a more kind of office-based position, where they could introduce changes in the way that they do things, or that they can be set a series of objectives and then have freedom on how they achieve those objectives. So you might have a different template for an organisation that is predominantly office-based, or maybe a department that's predominantly office-based versus a department that is predominantly manufacturing-based. So yeah, we've put together templates, but ideally they should be bespoke to the organisation's need.
Thank you, Marcus. I'm going to go with another question. What are your thoughts on tackling stress in organization where the main stressor are outside of the control of the employer? For instance, in an ambulance service, they can't necessarily reduce demands by employing more people, and they can't reduce the number of emergency calls they respond to.
Yeah, I think thank you for that. That's a really good question, and it is relevant to a lot of organisations these days. That sometimes we find that the biggest sources of stress are actually the things that we can't do anything about. And I think this is where the importance of sort of developing our leaders and developing the resilience of our individuals comes in. So if you remember, I talked about reducing or mitigating the risk. So that's one where we would say, right, okay, we cannot eliminate the risk for work overload, for example, and you just use the ambulance service there. So we can't do those things. We can't suddenly get more staff. We can't reduce the number of calls as much as we might try. So it's then, well, okay, we know that's there. We know that's a risk. We know it's causing work-related stress to our people. So how can we mitigate it? What are the best ways in which we can actually help people to cope with or deal with that? And some of that might be around leadership behaviours and leadership style and how we actually interact with our people, but some of it might be about just helping them to develop ways of actually coping with that pressure the best that they can. So I think there's a general recognition, in this area, but particularly by HSE, that it's impossible to eliminate some of those risks, unfortunately. I think there's quite often subtle things you can still do. So no, you might not be able to have more staff and you might not be able to reduce the number of calls, but is there anything you can do in terms of the way that you organise the work? That there might be something, if you go out to your people and say, right, okay, we know this is a problem, have you got any solutions to it? Often those people do have, and often we don't ask people for solutions, and that's part of that risk assessment process, which I probably didn't really mention, but it's really important when we're putting together interventions that we go back to the people that we've asked the questions of and say, what would you suggest? So we shouldn't be sat there, dictating what interventions we think are going to sort out the problem. We should be asking our people, this is a problem, what do you suggest the solution is? And most of the time they do have some sort of solution or suggestion that would just help a little bit. So that's what I would encourage you to do in that instance, is to take that back to the people and ask them if they've got any suggestions. But no, I think, I acknowledge that we cannot suddenly reduce or eliminate all of the work-related stress risk within our businesses. It's unfortunately not possible.
Yeah, just to continue on from what Karen was saying there as well, that just by performing the actual stress risk assessment itself and identifying what might be the causes of stress within a department or within a team, unfortunately, that isn't the work is done. That then provokes, or it gives insight into, okay, well, what are the areas that we might be able to have the opportunity to change? Or what are the areas that we might need to take and put into a business case for changing the job design or the number of people that we have staff? Obviously, I'm not suggesting that you can suddenly develop a business case off a stress risk assessment and then increase the number of staff in an ambulance service. But what we have to take away from as a key point here is that doing the stress risk assessment is the beginning of the process, or it's the way to identify what change might be possible within a job design. The other thing is a couple of watch outs. We see within the wellbeing industry that providing something like counselling or an EAP service or resilience training would be a kind of a go-to intervention for a team that is stressed. And whilst that might be with good intention and it might have positive impact for a short period of time, unfortunately, it doesn't matter how much resilience training you provide or how much counselling you provide. If the job design itself is a primary cause of stress within the workplace, then you will always end up having stress within the workplace. So I'm not suggesting that resilience training and EAPs and counselling shouldn't be part of the conversation. They should be part of the continuum of this prevention and treatment, and they should be part of the treatment and part of that continuum. But it's important that going through the processes that Carolyn has outlined as part of the presentation might help you to identify subtle changes that could be introduced to then eventually see a reduction in the overall stress of the department.
Thank you. I do have another question. We do have a lot of questions coming through, so we're not going to be able to answer all of them, but we will collect them and circulate it after the webinar. I do have a question that they're asking about. Is generally observed that most of the organization neglect mental health, and how that we can approach that, as well as second question, same in the same chat. Whenever we conduct surveys to assess the psychological risk, what would be the best approach and the most effective? Would be an individual based or group based?
Yeah, not individual based. So if we start to try to assess, as I said earlier, every individual within our organisation, that's a minefield. So what we want, obviously, is for people to feel comfortable enough to actually come forward to somebody within the organisation and say, you know, help, I'm struggling, and it is work related. When that happens, then yes, we need an individual work-related stress risk assessment that we can conduct in conjunction with the individual. So that's fine. But other than those cases, then really what we need to be doing is looking, as I say, HSE says at an organisational level, but I think the team approach is a good one, and it's certainly the one that I tend to use with my clients, is to encourage them to look at work-related stress risk assessments by team. But sometimes what you find when you look at your overall data before you do the risk assessment, and you look at your other data that you have out there, sometimes what you find is that actually it's not so much about teams, it's about levels in an organisation. So then you may choose to approach it not in a team way, but to start to look at different job groups or categories within an organisation, or levels within an organisation. I think this is where, as I said, the preparation is really important, that you're able to get some sort of handle on the stats that you've already got within your business that allow you to then think, well, what's the best approach for me and my organisation to use for this work-related stress risk assessment, rather than just sort of plough on with, well, this is best practice, this is what HSE suggests, this is what whoever suggests. Let's look at our data, let's really try and understand it, and then let's use an approach that is going to work and is most likely to work for our organisation. And I think the first part of that question was around this sort of reluctance to address mental health within organisations. I think that's still there. We're making big progress in that area in a lot of organisations, but you know, there is still that real stigma attached to the term mental health, even though mental health in itself isn't a negative term. You know, we all have mental health. It might be good, it might be poor, or somewhere in between. But we should really be talking about mental health in the same way as we talk about physical health, when we tend to mean good physical health. But often starting to talk about work-related stress risk assessment can actually be quite a good way of starting to dip your toe in the water with the whole mental health area, because it's quite tangible, and because you're not asking individuals to open up about their own situation, you're just trying to get an overall picture of what's happening within your business. It is almost dipping your toe in the water and are just starting to have that conversation, and you can then from that move forward, which is really the way you should be doing it, because that's the first part of your strategy. So if you're looking at mental health and wellbeing in your business, the first thing you should be doing is some sort of assessment of what the problems are, and then all these other things, and you know, Marcus just talked about EAPs and counselling and, you know, mental health first aid, all of those things. We need to identify whether there's a need for them, where the need is, before we implement things because it sounds good. We need to have that evidence base, really, in order to properly tackle this area within our businesses.
Thank you so much. I'm afraid we need to now wrap up, but thank you to Dr. Carolyn and Marcus, and thank you for our attendees for joining us today and for participating to the webinar. We hope you found the session really useful and informative. As the webinar closes, we would like to remind you that we have at the end a short survey, and we would be really appreciated if you could give us some feedback. It should take less than a minute. Also, if you would like to hear more about the Being Well Together program, you can also let us know within the survey, or you can also go on our website, beingwelltogether.org. I would like also to take this opportunity to highlight that we're going to have an upcoming virtual wellbeing conference on the 24th of April with the lineup of speakers across the day, and I want to again say a big thank you to our speakers and have a wonderful day. Thank you.
Thank you.